So you tell me your thoughts on Ben Reilly. So I am okay with the Ben Reilly stuff. I don't hate the Clone Saga as much as other people do. So fun thing. All right. So let me take you through what the Clone Saga was supposed to be. The Clone Saga. And also, funny thing, I don't know how we get into these things on this red screen, but I had that pointed out to me by a friend of mine. She said, whenever you go into one of these rants, you always seem to do it on a red screen at the end of Mario. And I'm like, oh, that's very interesting. Um, so here's the thing. So Ben Reilly is actually a really, really easy, was a really ingenious idea to do something that nobody wanted. So what had happened is that over the course of time, just the big slog of background of comic books in the mid 90s was becoming a lot for writers to keep up with. And they were doing lots of them were doing all kinds of things to kind of remove themselves of the weight of this deep canon they had for 30 plus years. That's why Superman did the Death and Return of Superman. That's why Batman did Batman Nightfall and Beyond, and there's some other stuff too. That's why in Crisis of Infinite Earths, which is a little bit before that, but that's why they get rid of Barry Allen and they bring Wally Weston as the main Flash. That was later. I mean, all this stuff is then later undone, of course. Because what they found is that no, people like these characters for a reason. But the idea was always to free up all of the writers with the ability to really give them freedom to make new stories. And if I remember, I have an idea of a way to actually do that would be better than what they try to do sometimes. So the idea is that and a lot of this stuff, some of it had met with okay press, like Barry Allen had worked because Wally West had already been so well established, and Barry really did die. I mean, he sacrificed himself to save the multiverse and all stuff like that. They did turn that video game into a comic. That's right. And some of it hadn't worked so well, like the Death and Return of Superman. While it's a pretty good story overall, it does have some issues, and a big thing that happened was it kind of really started the speculation of comics and stuff like that, which is part of the grading stuff that we talked about earlier and everything. But so what they came up with at Marvel was the idea was to do twofold things. One was to get rid of a lot of backlog and a lot of baggage that Peter carried with him to free up writers to do new things. And the second thing was to sell a lot of comic books. Because the Death and Return of Superman sold a lot of comics. Batman Nightfall and Beyond sold a ton of comics. And so the Marvel guys are like, we need to sell a lot of comics, and also we need to accomplish this other specific goal. Now, they did sell a ton of comics. So goal 2 was totally achieved. Goal 1 is where they messed up at. So the idea was that they saw the things that worked and didn't work with other heroes. So they eventually decided, they're like, what better idea than people, what better idea, why don't we replace our superhero with himself? So the Clone Saga happens, and the original idea of the Clone Saga, and it sort of happens in the comic, but then because of public backlash and because of a big editorial change and a big writing staff change, that was the real reason that it changed, not just because of public backlash. Because the public, even though there was so much negative press and things like that about it at the time, it was still selling a ton of comics. And let's face it, that's all they care about. Their business. And so the original idea was that it would turn out that the Peter Parker everyone had known since the mid 70s, right? When the original Jackal story took place. Hey, Reddit, how are you doing? When the original Jackal story had taken place, that the Peter that everyone had known since then was actually a clone. And that Ben Reilly that then shows up isn't a clone. He's the real Peter Parker and always has been. He's just been living somewhere else. Thanks for the follow, Red Oddie. Appreciate that. So they were like, we're going to replace Peter with himself. And then everyone will be happy. And then this Peter that's been around forever, he can retire with Mary Jane. So he gets his happily ever after. And then the real Peter, he can his sort of happily ever after by retaking over the mantle of Spider-Man, right? That's a brilliant idea. It's actually kind of ingenious. They're like, we're going to replace our hero with the real him. So all this time, this person you thought was real isn't the real hero. So we're going to replace him with himself. It's actually kind of an ingenious move. But what they didn't really think about was a really great thing was that is that people refused to accept it. They were like, no way. They're like, no, I refuse to accept that the 20 years that I've been reading these comics, since that point, it's been a different character. It wasn't really Peter. No. So there's like all these things that happened. Like, I mean, that would have negated some of the black suit stuff. That would have negated stuff with Black Cat. That would have negated stuff with, who else? Just all these other, like all that stuff didn't matter. It was like, well, it mattered, but it didn't matter. So then they had to then reverse their thing, because at this point, they had already replaced Peter with Ben, right? Ben was taking over the Scarlet Spider, and the idea was that over time he would stop being the Scarlet Spider. He would just become Spider-Man. And so they kind of had to roll things back, and then they had a big editorial change at the time. And the new editor came in, and they were like, look, we are not doing that. This guy's been Peter. He's going to stay Peter. This guy's the clone. Make it happen. So between the backlash and between the editorial change, and then they had a writer change, and Marvel was going through a lot of turnover right at this time, because the original story was only supposed to go for like a year, but they kept rolling because it was selling so well that the editor before his editorial change said, like, we got to keep this going. I know you planned for a year. Let's go 2 years. So it went for almost 2 years. And I'm talking about what they were doing is you had Amazing Spider-Man, you had Scarlet Spider, you had Web of Spider-Man, and all these were parts of the story. So you'd have part 1 in Amazing, you'd have part 2 in Web, you'd have part 3 in Scarlet, you'd have part 3 in part 4 in Spectacular, and so on and so forth. So they were selling a ton of comics. They were like, we got to keep this rolling. Then the big editorial change happened. There's starting to be some really heavy backlash and everything. The new editors were like, look, we don't want this. We got to end this story, and you got to put the real Peter back. That's what you have to do. Because Ben had only been like taken over for like a month or two at that time. And that's why, like, I have some of the issues where it's like Scarlet Spider-Man #1, Amazing Scarlet Spider-Man #1, Spectacular Scarlet Spider-Man #1. They were supposed to turn into ongoing series. They never made it past like 2 issues, some of them. So then they had to roll on the whole thing of like, well, really, it's been Norman Osborn behind this whole clone thing the whole time, because he hasn't been dead since he died on the bridge when he killed Gwen. Well, when they killed Gwen. Not because Gwen's dead, but because Green Goblin didn't really kill her. She died because when Peter tried to stop her fall, it snapped her neck and everything. And so they had to, so it turns out Norman's been alive this whole time, hide in France, because that's where you go to hide. And it turns out that all been manipulated, and all the results had been faked by Norman, so this Ben Reilly really was the clone. And then to solidify that he really was the clone, at one point, he sacrifices himself to save Peter, and he turns to dust, which is what happens when the clones, when they die, they turn to dust. And so then by doing that, it signifies that, okay, all this is over. He's really the real Peter. That really was the clone. And now everything's back to the status quo. And we have you could call him the big bad villain of Norman Osborn, but here's the thing. Up until he throws Gwen off the bridge, and then afterwards with the Clone Saga stuff, Norman wasn't like the main villain. He was honestly kind of a second-tier villain. The main villain was Dr. Octopus. That was the main villain. And when Norman throws, hey, Crazy Weasel, K for Mario was blessed with comic lessons, still love it. It happens a lot on here where I get thrown off onto tangents by folks that are watching. And it came up about the Clone Saga in Spider-Man. So bear with me. We'll get back to the game in a second. I love Spider-Man, so I have to focus on one thing. So when he does, so until like I said, when that happens, it kind of elevated Norman and the Green Goblin into this, and then afterwards when Harry takes over as the Green Goblin, kind of elevates the Green Goblin to this first tier villain role. When honestly before that he had been really a second tier villain. So I actually, here's the thing, I kind of like the Clone Saga. I think I used to hate it, honestly. But I hated it when I was reading it as a kid. Hey, thanks for the follow, Crazy Weasel. Appreciate that. So as a kid growing up reading it, I didn't like it because I was like, I don't want this other guy to be Spider-Man. I don't want him to take over. I'm like, that's Peter. And then all that happened. I'm like, that was so dumb. Like, why did we do that? But now I've gone back and I've reread it, and I'm like, you know, in a way, this is actually really well done, because when you're able to sit down and just read like the omnibus, which is like this big, by the way, it's a big collection, and that's just collecting the main storyline. It's not collecting some of the side stories and stuff like that. When you sit down and read it, you can see the genius in it. And no, it won't be a red screen for Tiger Talks tomorrow. No, it'll probably just be my camera and if Disco Liz, if she's okay being on camera, that'll just be our 2 cameras side by side. If she's not, then you all just get to look at me in front of some kind of background. I don't know what yet. It's kind of ingenious the way that they wanted to replace a hero with himself. It's very interesting. And so as an adult, I can appreciate the kind of the craft of it, and honestly, the excellent writing that it does, that was kind of hindered by editorial oversight in a lot of ways. Like, I think if it had just ran for a year, if they had really just stuck to their guns and put Ben in there, I honestly think that today we'd be seeing movies with Ben Reilly in them and not Peter Parker. I really do think that. But, you know, things happen the way they happen, and there's been, and not only that, but there have been other Spider-Man specific stories that have happened since then that I genuinely still do dislike, that have made me appreciate what the Clone Saga was trying to do. So that's how I feel about Ben Reilly. Anyway, let's jump back into the game. Red Screen Rants. That's not a bad name, actually.